Hello, welcome to Converging Dialogues. This is Xavier Bonilla. On this episode, I am very happy to bring you the conversation I had with the wonderful Alice Driver. Alice is a writer and author. She has a master's and PhD in Hispanic Studies from the University of Kentucky. She has won many awards for her journalism and writing, and in 2025, she'll be resident at the Bellagio Center. She is the author of the award-winning book, The Life and Death of the American Worker, the Immigrants Taking on America's Largest Meatpacking Company. It is a powerful book. It's not very big, which is great. I kind of read it in a couple sittings. I was just kind of blown away by something I don't think about on an everyday basis, and a lot of the injustice and a lot of the harms and ills that are going on for workers in those facilities, and especially immigrant workers. It was a bit of a revelation for me, and I was very happy to talk with her about it. We started by talking about this concept she says in the beginning of the book about moral beauty and immigrants' work. We talk about the immigrants who work in meatpacking factories, why, how they get here, what the incentives are, and then a kind of inside, behind the scenes look at how these factories operate. So, a lot of outsiders don't get to get in there and look, and so she has a lot of detailed accounts from people that have worked there, what's going on there. We talk about the on-site medical clinics and how when people get injured, which happens unfortunately often, what happens, how people aren't really allowed to take time off necessarily, and it's very, very difficult. We talk about the Clinton's relationship with Tyson Foods and some of the challenges Tyson Foods had during the pandemic in terms of how the mistreatment of many of their workers was. We talk about the class action lawsuit against Tyson Foods, future of the industry, and many more topics. Again, this is a really important issue. This is something that I think is, when folks go to the store and they get some food from Tyson Foods, not knowing the process of what happens, there's obviously the argument that people have made and shed a light on in terms of some of the animals that are in these big warehouse farms and some of the mistreatment there, but also on the other side, the workers that are there that are also getting mistreated as well. There's a lot of awful things there. So, Alice is doing, again, just exceptional work in doing the hard research, talking to these folks and getting the word out there. And it's not a surprise that people are recognizing and applauding her work for what she's doing there. As always, you can find this conversation and all other conversations at convergingdialogues.substack.com, also on YouTube. So please subscribe to the Substack. And if you like this episode, there's plenty of others in the back catalog that are also probably close to this as well, with many, many topics, many wonderful guests. And if you like it, subscribe, tell your friends, have them subscribe. I know there's a lot of podcasts out there, so if you find one you like, and this is one of those ones that you like, just spread the word. And now I bring you Alice Driver. I am here with Alice Driver. Alice, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. It's really lovely to see you, and I'm excited to talk with you.
Oh, thank you for reading my book.
Yes, you have a exceptional book. I really enjoyed it. I was like, oh, it's short. It's a short book. So it was a really easy read in that sense. But I had all these feelings when I was reading it, and it's great. It's great. It's really, really well written. And it's really, really good. The book is called Life and Death of the American Worker, the Immigrants Taking on America's Largest Meatpacking Company. And that's what we're going to talk about. Before we do, just tell listeners who you are professionally and what you're currently up to.
My name is Alice Driver. I'm an investigative journalist, and I'm from the Ozark Mountains of Arkansas. And I often work in Spanish because I lived for many years in Mexico City.
Very, very nice. Very, very nice. Yeah, listeners will will hear that very nice accent, which is nice. Some people, when I go other places, people say I have an accent, but I don't think so. I don't think Marylanders have
I
an
feel the
accent.
same. I always think that I don't.
Oh, really? Oh, that's funny. Yeah, it's weird to like you just you know your own voice or whatever. So it's nice. I really really like it. So,
Mhm.
um, okay, so maybe you can kind of drop us into what for the book, right, and for the story that you're telling. There's a general story you're telling, and then you follow a series of, if you will, characters. These immigrant stories, and there's some few people we'll talk about. But I thought it was interesting that you start the book by talking about moral beauty, which is interesting, juxtaposed with evil. How do you see moral beauty in immigrants who come to the U.S. and who do hard work in the country? Why did you want to start with that kind of lens, if you will, for the stories you tell?
Well, this is really rooted. I went to Berea College, which is one of the few work schools in the United States, and it was founded to educate really Appalachians and freed slaves in the late 1800s. And it charges no tuition, and you work for the school. And there I met another writer who, at the time we wanted to be writers, but her name is C. Morgan, and she's been nominated for a Pulitzer. And I always have her work in my mind. And she's only done maybe one or two interviews. She's a writer who is really not public facing.
Hmm.
And one of the interviews that she did was about moral beauty and thinking about moral beauty as love in action, and then opposing it with evil. And she talked about evil in terms of reducing others to an object or to a component. And so when I was doing this work, I was really thinking about that because the workers, the poultry processing workers who I followed, are, over the course of the book, you see them being reduced to objects, to machines, to components. And, humans are not machines. Their bodies cannot operate as a machine. And by the end of the book, many of them are dead, others are on disability, others are, you know, um, they have carpal tunnel surgeries that they need, or they've been severely injured in some kind of an accident at the factory, a chemical accident. And so I really wanted to frame the work that they're doing in terms of their resilience and their dedication, because a lot of conversations about meatpacking workers, especially unfortunately, with animal rights groups, animal rights groups do kind of blame workers for the jobs that they're doing. They'll say, "Oh, they're violent," or
Hmm.
what if they had a pet like a dog? Would they, decapitate it and cut it up? And all these kind of weird arguments that really, in a way, that frame immigrant laborers as violent or as bad. And I really wanted to rethink, like, what are these workers doing? What are their lives like? And what is the beauty and the strength and the resilience of what they're doing in spite of, for example, work conditions?
Hmm. Hmm. Let me ask. Well, you can talk about some of them a little bit here, but I was curious. Obviously, there's a whole industry, the meatpacking industry, and folks that do with poultry and all this. And why did you want to focus, I guess, on the immigrant story as opposed to maybe white or black Americans that work in these places as well? I mean, I think they're sort of mentioned in the book, but you focused on the immigrant story, and I'm curious as to why that was the kind of central focus of the book for you, and what is it that is distinct about immigrants that work in these places, or not? Why was that the central focus?
Well, immigrants and refugees are the largest percentage of labor at meatpacking companies across the United States, not just Tyson Foods, which is the largest meatpacking company, and it's headquartered in Arkansas, which is where
Mm.
I'm from. But all, meatpacking companies in general rely increasingly on immigrants and refugees and undocumented people. And I wanted us to think about that because for several reasons. One issue is that the percentage of Black people, for example, working in the meatpacking industry in the 60s and 70s, the Black people who were working in meatpacking started to organize for their labor rights. So how did meatpacking companies respond? They responded by looking for more vulnerable populations who, who weren't going to be maybe familiar with their rights, who weren't going to be organizing, who weren't native speakers of English, who were perhaps illiterate. And so, that is a strategy that companies have really employed and leaned on to, in many ways, prevent labor organizing around having safer work conditions.
Yeah, it's quite an astounding piece that it's such a majority, and as you detail in the book and here is this idea of what kind of goes on. So tell us one of the major some of the major figures in the book that you follow in the book, and their story is Angelina and Placido, right? And they have a migration story to the United States from the very small country of El Salvador in Central America. It's where listeners will know that's where my dad hails from as well. He also was a migrant to this country, so it was interesting, kind of seeing that story and seeing some common things that it's kind of like, oh yeah, this sounds like one of my uncles or whatever. So yeah, it's really, really interesting there. What's that kind of their story? I guess there's obviously there's things in media and things like that of, people that come here to the country illegally or, whatever, undocumented. And there's some kind of narrative that certain people try to pose and all this. But a lot of times they have a humble life, or impoverished life, or in some cases crime or conflict. And they come here, no papers, undocumented. And then they come and work in a meatpacking company, trying to get something to go for themselves and to send money back, and then they have all these conditions that they have in a new country with a new language and no papers and not really any rights. So you really illustrate a lot of these themes with their story. Maybe just kind of the snapshot of their story and how it's a little bit illustrative of many immigrant stories for these places.
Well, I want to put, first of all, Tyson Foods in context. Last year,
sure.
The company had $53 billion in sales. And so I really make this point, that the company has really had, especially during the pandemic, had years of very high profits. And so in terms of investing in labor conditions, which is the central issue of my book, it's something that could be done. And Angelina and Placido are from El Salvador. They met in El Salvador. Angelina never went to school. She started working from a young age. She's illiterate. And Placido, they met at a river when she was washing clothes. And he came to the U.S. first. And several meatpacking workers that I spoke to said, that people said, come to Arkansas, there's jobs in the meatpacking industry. And unlike with agriculture, meatpacking isn't seasonal. And so he arrived, and then later Angelina arrived, and they both began working at Tyson Foods. And the workers that I followed for 4 years, they want these jobs, they want to do them well. What they don't want is a lot of times what they have lived through, which is conditions that are prone to chemical accidents or injuries from the large machinery that is in the factory, or knives or scissors, or getting caught in any of them, the machinery that is involved in meatpacking plants. And so when I met Angelina during the pandemic, she told me that her husband was predicting his own death. And it's interesting because I came into this thinking that I was writing about COVID work conditions. But what I learned from Placido was he thought he was going to die of COVID because he had been in a serious chemical accident at the Tyson Foods plant in Springdale in 2011. And it had destroyed an entire lung. Basically, ammonia had eaten up a lung. So he had basically a partially functioning lung. And he knew, he knew, and I think of a death foretold in that sense. He was thinking, if I get COVID, I'm dead. And he did die. He did get COVID, and he did die of COVID. And what was happening in Arkansas, according to the workers that I interviewed, was that because the way that Tyson functions, you need workers on the line really close together. So you cannot keep up production if you let workers quarantine for COVID. So workers who really don't have much choice were told, even if they tested positive, said that they were told to continue working. And so what happened? Arkansas had a huge outbreak of COVID at meatpacking facilities, and the only greater outbreak was in prisons. And so when Placido died, Angelina wanted the company to be held responsible for those conditions, for asking workers with COVID to work, which meant that other workers like her husband got infected. And it was beautiful and powerful for me to watch her figure out, how am I going to do this? How am I going to coordinate and organize with other workers? And it just so happened that an organization called Venceremos had started organizing workers, and it was a worker-led organization. And so these workers, many of whom had family members, Tyson workers who died of COVID, came together and tried to figure out how to file a class action lawsuit. And that essentially took the 4 years that I followed this story.
Maybe for some people that don't know, it might say, well, each job's got their risks. Each job's going to have difficult parts about it. Obviously, that's not going to be an easy job to do. Maybe a callous person would say, or kind of, not fully knowing everything. Like, well, what's the big deal? You're going to have some accidents. There's going to be some things that are tough in any kind of industry. You do this in a book, so maybe give us a little bit of a picture here of what it's like on the inside, and why some of that is not really allowed to kind of get an inside look of what's going on in these plants. But tell us what it's like to work with these plants. I mean, they don't have all the equipment they need. There's crazy safety hazards galore. On the floor, on the tables, on the so many different things. People get injured. All these stuff. Where does OSHA fit in here or not fit in here? Where do labor laws fit in here, not fit in here? Just kind of give us an inside look here of what's going on in these plants.
Let me give you a few examples of very preventable safety conditions. For example, workers told me that when they go to work in the morning and they enter the plant, they have a lot of safety equipment, mesh metal gloves, because they're working with sharp knives, and the most common accident is them cutting themselves, and it can be cutting off a finger, cutting themselves to the bone, all kinds of accidents, even a worker at a Tyson plant in Alabama who is decapitated. So we're talking big machinery, big blades. And in the case of workers with the mesh metal gloves, there's different sizes of gloves. And workers told me that every morning they have to go in and basically grab their size, and if there is no more of that size, then they have to use, for example, a small person has to use a large glove, and you might say, oh, well, no big deal. But that, you could lose your hand in an accident simply because you do not have the right size of protective glove. And then other accidents, which are very common statistically across the meatpacking industry, are chemical accidents, because the chemicals at any given plant, when you mix them, if you mix them incorrectly, can produce weapons-grade chemicals. And so in my book, I try to get into this. You have workers from Myanmar, from the Marshall Islands, from Vietnam, from Thailand, and they all speak their native language. And so imagine if they're mixing chemicals and all the instructions and everything is in English. And so even though Tyson Foods says that they provide translators and translations, at some plants there's 20 languages, 50 different languages, and workers tell me there are not translators, or all of the materials are in English. And so these are things that are preventable, but they do require, some investment in translators and materials and gloves. In the case of the worker who was decapitated, he was washing a large machine. He was inside it to wash it, and it turned on. And that machine had a safety but the plant had not maintained the safety on the machine, and so it cut his head off, and that was preventable. And then the next problem is the fines. If a plant is fined by OSHA, which is the body that oversees safety and health, the fines are so negligible that it's essentially cheaper to injure or kill a worker than it is to maintain, basic safety.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite alarming that so many of these things are preventable. But the other thing is we're talking about this for not something, some higher cause or some sort. We're talking about mass production of meat. So, it's people are losing their, arms and fingers and, all these things with preventable ways of navigating that, just so I can get my, chicken nuggets in the freezer section at the store from Tyson Foods. Like that's the cost here. So I mean, I don't know if I could ever buy chicken nuggets after reading your book again from Tyson Food, but you talk about this. You talk about like the process and what goes in and kind of like a daily working life. Okay, so there's all these risks, and there's all these handling of all these things, but there's long hours, and they're using all these different chemicals, and you're, of course, kind of like you mentioned earlier, animal rights groups get very incensed, which is fair. I mean, I don't even know if you can call them really chickens at this point anymore. They're just injected with all this stuff. They're really the size, super huge. They're overpopulated. They're just slicing and dicing them, using all their parts, just throwing them in. I mean, what's this like process of like how they're? I mean, excuse the pun here. How the sausage gets made here, like how this stuff is working, like what's a normal kind of day-to-day thing in a meatpacking, plant industry? How many hours? What are they actually doing? What are they handling? What's kind of going on here?
So I would start out my interviews by asking workers what job they did, because there were so many jobs. One worker, I said, "What do you do?" He said, "I pick up condemned chicken." And I said, "What is condemned chicken?" "Oh, that's, what's on the floor, and they use it to make dog food." "Oh, okay, so that's a job, picking up condemned chicken, or cleaning the poop off of chicken feet, or
So I mean that in itself is I mean, if you're doing that for hours every day, just fecal matter, on your hands. I mean, you have to very, very. I mean, you could have good equipment, but you still have to very, very much like have good sanitation, because if that's going in your mouth, your eyes, I'm like, oh my goodness, like there's so many diseases you can get. Like it's such a hazard. It's such a hazard.
Yeah, and so it's simple things. One worker told a story of he got blood in his eye
Oof.
from the line, and it got super infected. And the other part of this story is that Tyson has on-site clinics, so they keep medical care on-site. And so he went to the on-site nurse, which Tyson employees call them Tyson nurses, even though Tyson says they're not our nurses because they're third-party hires. So he went to the nurse. The nurse said, "Oh, you're fine. Go back to work." And he was talking to another worker, and he said, "What should I do? Because if you go outside of the Tyson on-site medical care, you have to pay for it. And for workers, that's often, they can't afford that." And the other worker said, "Look, if you go blind, Tyson is not going to care for you." And so that worker went to an outside doctor and got, medical care to deal with, the infection in his eye. And so these are just small examples, because imagine, how much blood there is, how much chicken poop, and I mean the stories that workers told me, of worm infestations and weevils in the flour, and just it was a lot.
Yeah, it's one thing. It's like, well, if that happens once, but you're going every day and you're having to deal with some version of this. I mean, that's very, very, very tough. And I'm sympathetic because, again, to remind listeners here, folks are coming to this country illegally, quote unquote, and they are they are putting a lot of risk. And in many cases, if they have a transporter that gets them here, across the Mexican border, that's extremely expensive. So the work they're doing for a while is having to pay that back. Then usually they're sending, money home, and then living here, and all of these things. And then on top of that, someone that is illiterate, that doesn't mean that they're dumb. Not by any means. Intelligence doesn't work exactly that way. There's obviously a difference between intelligence and academics, but there is definitely going to be some things that they are a bit more sensitive to. Maybe they're not going to be as proactive about things, or maybe I learned in health class in 4th grade or 8th grade. Like you don't, if you don't have that, there's common sense, but there is some things that you do learn with just basic education. So not knowing, I could get infected, or am I going to get gangrene, or am I going to stuff like that. And people could probably you have all those other factors, and then the health piece. And if you're not totally understanding of many of these things, or you're believing other things that people tell you, or what you heard when you were growing up in your town, these are pretty, in some ways, it's a vulnerable kind of population, people that are working here. That's when I was reading this, I was kind of trying to put all the pieces together in my head, and it's like it feels very much as if people that are being taken advantage of, and whether it's obviously known or ignorant to, or turning a blind eye to, but it certainly feels that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, part of the issue with the on-site medical clinics is that, for example, the workers who I interviewed who were in the chemical accident in 2011, they were consistently told that they were fine for years, and they were fainting, they couldn't breathe, they couldn't work for, one worker who was in the chemical accident, she was told come back to work next day, and she described, fainting and having to be, wheeled away in a wheelchair. And then, she spent all these years being told, you're fine, you're fine, you're fine. And finally, when she had the resources, she went to an outside doctor who said, you are not fine. One of your lungs was really destroyed by this chemical accident. And that was true for several workers. And of those workers, several died of COVID during the pandemic. And the other thing is that many of these things, as I've said, are preventable. One of the issues with the repetitive work and carpal tunnel syndrome, because many workers have carpal tunnel in both hands and they need surgery. And one of the workers in my story never got approved for it. And so as the book ends, she can't work. She needs disability. She's at home. She's got all these pain medications, but she can't have surgery because the on-site clinic has not approved her for surgery. But that could all be prevented if workers are supposed to switch jobs so that they're not, not always doing the exact same repetitive job. If you have people switching lines over certain periods of time, that reduces the repetitive motion injury. But, companies don't want to do that because they want to just get as much production out of you as they can. And then, and then you can't work, but maybe you can't even get disability because you can't get through all the systems that you're required to get through in order to prove that you need disability.
That's very much the kind of navigating through a minefield of sorts, which is unfortunate. You mentioned this, so maybe expand on it a little bit. What is when there's accidents? You mentioned, I think earlier, the chlorine gas leak and stuff. Where do they go? You said there's a kind of on-site thing. Is this the occupational health nursing model thing, or no? Is this something different?
Well, they call them on-site clinics, and they're a third-party provider, but they're on-site at the plant. And so I interviewed one of the nurses who she had worked at several Tyson plants in Arkansas, and she's the only person who agreed to speak to me as long as I didn't use her name. And she said, we do our best, but the pressure on us is Tyson wants to be able to say on any given day we had 0 injuries. And so how do you define an injury? If you tell workers, if you tell them to ice, you give them ice, you give them aspirin, and you send them back to work, there's no injury. And so the pressure is to just say that everything is fine, ice it, take a Tylenol, go back to work. And that way there's no recorded injuries.
Is this a on-site thing? Is this like a CYA thing for Tyson, and also a thing where they can say, well, yeah, we're providing this, we're doing our due diligence, and it's less likely that you're going to ask for time off because, see, there's a place here and you can just go back to work. Is it kind of doing those two things at the same time, trying to save face, look good, okay, and we also don't want to, have people, leaving and just suck as much, of your time for working?
Yeah, I mean, they've integrated everything essentially into the plant. And so, it decreases. A worker gets injured, they go to the nurse. Nurse says, "Go back to work." Or if you need surgery, it has to be approved. You have to be approved to see a doctor or to have surgery. And the nurse that I spoke to said that what happens is that managers and supervisors come into the room with the injured parties and give their opinions, even though they're not medically trained. Oh no, they're fine. And she said it just creates an environment where it's hard you try to do the right thing, but it's hard to do it.
Let's talk a little bit about at a bigger level. So you mentioned the Clintons. Yeah, obviously, Clinton was governor of Arkansas for, was it 8 years? Right? Yeah. 8 years. Yes. And then obviously he was president for 8 years. What's their kind of involvement at the high level with like Tyson Foods, and how there has been, let's say, limited regulations or maybe some kind of loopholes? What's the kind of at the very top? You can say with him as governor there or otherwise, but where has Tyson Foods at that level been able to kind of continue to get away with some of these, at the very least, negligible behaviors for their workers?
Well, I thought it was interesting. It was interesting for me to revisit Clinton's relationship with the Tyson family, because I'm from Arkansas, but I had never looked into that. And Clinton was good friends with Don Tyson. And Don Tyson is one of the family members, the original family members, and many of them are still involved in the company. And so Don Tyson and Bill were close friends. They used to ride around. If you're in Arkansas, you hear all the gossip. They used to ride around. Don Tyson had an extensive car collection and yachts and houses all over. And he and Bill used to ride around in Don's Bentley. And Bill and Hillary would fly on Tyson's private jet. And Bill and Hillary got into trouble for some of this. And so when Clinton was governor, he did, for example, he did pass legislation that eased environmental protections, or, for example, eased regulations related to trucking that allowed Tyson to send greater amounts of chicken than was recommendable, like greater weights than were recommendable at the time. And so you could say, oh, that's not a big deal, but he did do things that were favorable to the company and that resulted during that time period in an immense growth for the company. And then, he had the support of the company when he was running for president. And it was really interesting because after he won, Don Tyson wrote a letter to the editor at a local newspaper. It was actually a newspaper in Oklahoma, saying, like, I am not friends with Bill Clinton. He has never helped me or my company ever. But even once Bill was president, Bill and Hillary got into trouble for issues related to gifts from Tyson to individuals in the Clinton administration. And then aside from that, it was a time period when both Don Tyson and Bill Clinton were well known, running around with a lot of young women. And it was to the degree that if you read the New York Times coverage of them from that time period, it says, oh, Don Tyson showed up at Wall Street with a whole group of beautiful young women. And when I went back to look at that time, Tyson had no women or people of color in any position of power at the company. So who was Don Tyson waltzing around with? Anyway, for me, as a woman who believes in equality and looking at these two individuals who were both very powerful, I just wanted to see how that relationship was mutually beneficial to the company and to Bill Clinton.
Yeah, it's just really interesting. I feel like in the era before social media and the internet, there's a lot of things people don't know, and then we kind of find out about it later. And you're like, oh man, if I knew that at the time, maybe I would have thought about this differently. So there's pros and cons to it, of course, but it is interesting how I feel like there's all of these things that continue to leak out, and we continue to learn about that. And I had a conversation with who was it? Liechtenstein. He's a labor guy, and he wrote a book on Clinton. I think it's called like I'm forgetting the name of it, but he talks about Clinton's presidency and while it was a fabulous failure. That's the title, and really how Clinton was not really that favorable with labor. And a lot of people don't know that, so this is like his wheelhouse, and so the whole book is basically just cataloging a bit when he was governor, but definitely as president, where he was not a friend to labor, which is very, very interesting.
That's Arkansas. That is Arkansas, and he's from a small town in Arkansas, and you cannot come up here into political power unless you are anti-labor.
Yeah,
I would say.
Yeah,
to this day.
Yeah, that's quite unfortunate. So there, you mentioned this coalition of workers. What's the name of it? It's this coalition of yeah, thank you, workers. What is this coalition, and how important are they for human rights for workers within this industry?
So the Coalition of Immokalee Workers is an organization in Florida that is made up of agricultural workers, and it's been around for 20 years, and they have done an incredible job. It's worker-led organizing, so workers getting together and saying, how can we improve conditions in agriculture, because there's really very little oversight. And they now have a radio station in Spanish. They have their own building. They've been really powerful in terms of pressuring organizations and politicians to make changes about the way that they source, for example, tomatoes, by having campaigns that educate the public about what they call modern slavery, which is really conditions where workers have, they work unlimited hours. They're often not paid. They're working in extreme heat. There are no breaks, all of these kinds of things. And so the beautiful thing about the CIW is that they now train other groups of workers. And so I think it was in 2021 or 2022, I went with Arkansas poultry workers and an organization called Venceremos to Florida to meet with the CIW. And while we were there, they also had a group of milk workers from Vermont, a group of construction workers, I think from Minnesota, and all immigrant labor, which really tells a story about our food system. The backbone of our food system is really made up of immigrant labor, a lot of it undocumented. And why aren't we listening to these workers, to their stories? Why is it so hard for them to tell their stories? Why are they so afraid to tell their stories? And so those are questions that I wanted to explore. And I also wanted to show for Arkansas workers to see labor organizing in a place where it's been successful. It really blew their minds, because in Arkansas, it's absolutely a terrifying environment to organize in. Most of these workers they're organizing, but they're not. They don't want to be seen in public. They don't want to use their real names. They're afraid to be photographed. They're afraid to speak to a journalist. And that's why we don't hear their stories as much as we should.
Yeah, it's shining a light on something that we probably don't consider, but it is something that we definitely
take for granted the things that we get on the backs of other people. And it's a sobering thing, but I think it's a thing that we have to be more considerate of, and when we're making certain decisions as a community, as a collective, as as states and countries, for sure. You said that you started this book as a kind of pandemic kind of project of sorts, of trying to look at what was going on there. You're talking about kind of a last, I guess, quarter of the book talking about this. Just to get it out there, I guess. I mean, there's some pretty terrible things that Tyson's Food does to workers during the pandemic, some of which you already alluded to. Is there any charitable view here of like, well, it was, everyone was trying to figure out what was going on in 2020, and maybe they didn't know, or at what point do we say, nah, they definitely knew this, and this was totally egregious. This is totally terrible. Yeah. What I mean, there's obviously keeping a company running and all this stuff, but really sacrificing people's lives in a global health pandemic is just pretty monstrous. It's hard to really see any side of it. But yeah, I mean, is there early days? Is it kind of like we don't know, we're figuring it out, or what kind of happened of how they really handled this, the treatment of workers during the pandemic in, let's say, 2020, 2021, a little 2022?
The charitable view is the bottom line. The company was going to maintain profits and production regardless of circumstances, regardless of what was happening, regardless of COVID. Because as I've said, the things that need to change, some of them are very basic. Buying safety gloves in the correct sizes. Or in the case of COVID, social distancing. What does social distancing do? Social distancing decreases production. So how did Tyson management respond in recorded conversations that are in my book? They tried to make work, and they did this not just with workers, they did this publicly. They said, we are feeding the nation. If, they told a worker, do you want people to starve to death? Millions of Americans will starve to death. And this was a worker who wanted to quarantine himself. He said, because he was afraid he was going to get COVID, and he had 4 children, and he saw how the plant was being run. He said, I would like to have permission to stay home. And they said, well, do you want people to die? Is that what you want? You want to kill people? And so, to me, the charitable view is Tyson is a company that the corporate part of the company is mostly white. The line production is mostly people of color. And there's an equation in which, they're like, whatever we have to do to make money, because they made extreme profits especially during the first year of the pandemic. So why would you tell workers to sew their own masks? Like, what explanation can you give me for that? I mean, there's just so many things that, to me, it's the indignity of it is, and they're small things like, okay, buy masks, okay, buy gloves, okay, let people social distance, because in fact, we're not feeding the nation and no one is going to starve. And workers are smart. They know these things. And so during the pandemic, Tyson gave all workers a shirt that said, we're feeding the nation. And some of the workers added to that shirt of China, because Tyson was exporting chicken to China.
It's ugly. It's ugly. It is very, very ugly. There is a class action lawsuit that comes out of this in 2022 against Tyson Foods. What did that look like, and kind of where is it at now at this point, in back half of 2024?
So the workers, spent really 3 years organizing, finding a lawyer, and I cannot emphasize how difficult this kind of stuff is in Arkansas. They couldn't find a lawyer in Arkansas, which doesn't surprise me at all. Even when I needed to interview a lawyer in Arkansas for an article, I couldn't find a single lawyer who would say anything about Tyson on the record in this state.
Wow.
And so it took them a while to find a lawyer. And then because Arkansas passed legislation that's very pro-corporation. Arkansas passed what's called limited liability, which means that companies in this state are not responsible for anything related to COVID. So they couldn't sue Tyson for wrongful death. So they had to get around that. And they sued Tyson, and this was 43 people who came together, many of them workers whose family members had died of COVID or had, faced other injuries or were, on disability. They came together, and it was a big deal because in order to file the lawsuit, their names would be public. And they filed the lawsuit citing emotional distress, which is, truthfully, it's a hard thing to argue legally, that the death of these individuals, these family members, and the resulting, we're talking about hospital bills, $300,000, $600,000. It's not just that they died of COVID, it's that everything that came after that, the medical bills, the funeral, how are we going to pay for this? Suddenly no one's, there's no income. And so they lost this lawsuit. They lost it this year, which I feared in this state. I feared that they wouldn't win it. But I think the fact that they did it is incredible. It's inspiring. And they're continuing to organize. And I do think that even though they lost the lawsuit, the story of what they did and the story of what they suffered and their resilience, that will move people.
Yeah, it's just really, really difficult, though. So how do we change it, right? How do you change a big industry like that and reimagine, the U.S. food system? There are so many issues with the U.S. food system, different levels, from a nutritional standpoint, a policy standpoint, a worker labor standpoint. There's a lot of issues with the U.S. food system. But what do you think is feasible or has some generalizability or scalability of how to make good inroads or changes with this industry?
Let's start with the structural, which I think is the most important thing, and that's the issue that really requires Democrats, Republicans, bipartisan support to change. And one of the interesting things about Kamala Harris's economic plan is that she has said she wants to take on the consolidated power of the meatpacking industry, because the main issue with the meatpacking industry is that it's a few companies that run the entire market. And they have been accused of colluding both to increase prices for consumers and to keep wages down for workers. And so if there was more competition, there would not be such an issue with essentially the monopoly power in the meatpacking industry. So that's something that we can definitely solve, but it requires taking on companies that have a lot of influence, a lot of money invested in lobbying, a lot of political power. And then on a smaller scale, as individuals, as consumers, we can make choices about what we're consuming. Or we can be vegetarians, vegans. There's so many options these days. The idea that we need to eat unlimited, cheap, and frankly, in terms of quality, terrible meat, I don't know why is that considered something that's good for our health, for our nation, for workers. It's not good for any of us in that sense. And we really need to rethink that, because it's just reinvesting money into an industry that's profiting. But, what is coming back to us, the individuals who are, voting in this nation?
Yeah, I think there's been progress with that. I think one of the things that's really difficult about that with the other alternatives, as you said, which I think is it's totally fair on all those points, is a lot of people don't have access to those other alternatives. That's getting better, but if you get out of cities, it's much harder. But also those things tend to be more expensive, which is also frustrating, because it's like we shouldn't have to pay more to eat better. That makes no sense. But I do think that is the move. You have to, at the end of the day, you're making a long-term investment for yourself, for your family, for your health. And I think that in tandem with, the structural changes that have to be made, is the best that people can do. There's a kind of the macro and the micro level of doing things. And so I totally agree with you. I think your book is doing good work on that front. I never really know what to expect sometimes when I read books. I kind of go into it blind, and I kind of walked away feeling, pretty indignant about, some of the things that go on. It's a powerful little book that you have, little in terms of size, not in terms of content, and it's very, very, very good. I highly recommend it. Alice, you are so wonderful. I really appreciate you coming on and talking about a very, very important issue with your passion, with your clarity. It's just wonderful. So a big thank you.
No, thank you for having me and for reading the book so carefully and really thinking about the workers.
Absolutely.